For most of human history, power was easy to recognize. Empires ruled with armies, fleets, and flags planted on conquered land. But in the modern world, power often moves in silence. It travels through financial networks, trade routes, and the quiet decisions made in conference rooms, far from the battlefield. At the end of the Second World War, the global economy was in ruins. Europe was devastated, industries were destroyed, and millions of people faced an uncertain future. Leaders around the world understood that rebuilding cities would not be enough. The world also needed a new economic system strong enough to prevent another global collapse. In the summer of 1944, representatives from 44 nations traveled to a quiet resort in the mountains of New Hampshire. Their goal was simple but ambitious: design a financial order that could stabilize the world economy for generations. Inside those conference halls, economists, diplomats, and political leaders debated how currencies should work in a rapidly changing world. Eventually, a powerful idea began to take shape. The United States dollar, backed by massive American gold reserves and the industrial strength of the US economy, would become the foundation of global trade. Currencies around the world would be linked to the dollar, and the dollar itself would remain convertible into gold. The system promised stability, trust, and a new era of economic cooperation. Few people realized that the decisions made in that quiet mountain resort would shape global finance for decades and quietly place the dollar at the center of the modern economic world. For more than a decade after the new financial system was created, it appeared to work almost perfectly. Global trade expanded rapidly, economies recovered from the destruction of war, and the United States stood at the center of the new economic order. American factories produced enormous quantities of goods that were shipped across the world, while banks and governments began storing dollars as the most trusted reserve currency. Because the dollar could still be exchanged for gold, confidence in the system remained strong. But beneath the surface, a quiet imbalance was growing. As global trade increased, more and more dollars began circulating outside the United States. Foreign governments accumulated huge reserves of American currency, trusting that those dollars could always be converted into gold if necessary. At the same time, the United States government was spending heavily on international commitments, military operations, and domestic programs. More dollars were being created and sent into the global economy, but the amount of gold stored in American vaults was not increasing at the same pace. For a while, few people noticed the problem. But by the early 1960s, some economists and political leaders began asking a dangerous question. What would happen if too many countries tried to exchange their dollars for gold at the same time? If that ever occurred, the system that held the global economy together could face a crisis unlike anything the modern world had seen. By the late 1960s, the balance that once supported the global monetary system was beginning to weaken. For years, the United States had supplied the world with dollars, allowing trade to grow and economies to rebuild. But now, the amount of American currency circulating overseas was becoming enormous. Foreign governments were holding far more dollars than the United States actually had in gold reserves. At first, this imbalance remained mostly invisible to the public. Economists discussed it quietly in reports and private meetings, warning that confidence in the system depended on a delicate promise that any dollar could still be exchanged for gold. As doubts slowly spread, several countries began reconsidering their position. If too many nations demanded gold at the same time, the United States might not be able to honor that promise. Financial markets started to feel the tension. Central banks reviewed their reserves, diplomats debated the stability of the system, and behind closed doors, governments began making cautious decisions about their dollar holdings. What had once appeared to be the most stable monetary structure in modern history was now facing a dangerous test. The world's financial leaders were beginning to realize that the system created in the mountains of New Hampshire decades earlier might not survive the pressures of a rapidly changing global economy. By the end of the 1960s, the pressure on the international monetary system was no longer hidden. Governments across Europe had begun quietly calculating how many dollars they held compared to the amount of gold the United States claimed to possess. The numbers were troubling. There were now far more dollars circulating around the world than gold in American vaults to support them. Some leaders started asking a simple but dangerous question. If every country demanded gold for their dollars, could the United States actually pay? A few governments decided not to wait for the answer. Instead, they began converting their dollar reserves into gold while they still could. Shipments of gold started leaving American vaults and traveling across the Atlantic toward European central banks. Each transfer was small enough not to cause panic, but large enough to slowly drain the system. Inside financial ministries and central banks, the mood began to shift from confidence to caution. Economists debated possible solutions, diplomats held emergency meetings, and traders watched currency markets with growing concern. What had once been the most trusted financial system in the world was now facing a silent test of credibility. And with every gold shipment that left American reserves, the stability of the entire system moved one step closer to a breaking point. By the early 1970s, the pressure on the global monetary system had reached a critical level. For years, the United States had promised that every dollar could be exchanged for gold at a fixed price. But now, foreign governments held far more dollars than the American gold reserves could support. Confidence in the system was beginning to fracture. Some countries had already started converting their dollars into gold, quietly moving their reserves away from paper currency and back into physical metal. Inside government offices and financial institutions, the conversations were becoming urgent. Economists warned that if the trend continued, the United States could lose a large portion of its gold reserves. A situation that once seemed impossible was now becoming real. The foundation of the global financial system, the promise that the dollar was as good as gold, was beginning to collapse under its own weight. Leaders in Washington understood that something drastic might soon be required. Behind closed doors, officials debated difficult options: continue the system and risk losing the nation's gold reserves, or break the promise that had supported the global economy for decades. The decision would not only affect the United States, it would reshape the entire financial order of the modern world. In the summer of 1971, the crisis finally reached a breaking point. For years, pressure had been building on the global monetary system as foreign governments accumulated more and more American dollars. The promise that every dollar could be exchanged for gold was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Inside Washington, economic advisors warned that the United States might soon lose a significant portion of its gold reserves if the trend continued. The situation demanded a decision that could change the global economy overnight. In August of that year, the President of the United States gathered his closest advisors to discuss the future of the dollar. The options were limited and risky. Maintaining the system could drain the nation's gold reserves, while ending the gold convertibility of the dollar would break one of the most important financial promises in modern history. After days of intense discussion, a dramatic decision was made. On August 15, 1971, the United States would suspend the ability of foreign governments to exchange dollars for gold. The announcement would shock financial markets and mark the end of the system created decades earlier at Bretton Woods. The dollar would no longer be tied to gold, and the world would enter an entirely new era of money and global finance. When the United States suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold in August 1971, the world entered an entirely new monetary era. For the first time in modern history, the global financial system would operate without a direct link between money and precious metals. At first, many governments and economists feared that the decision might trigger chaos. Exchange rates between currencies began to move more freely, and financial markets had to adapt to a system that no longer relied on fixed gold-backed values. But over time, the international economy adjusted to the new reality. The United States dollar remained the dominant global currency, not because it was backed by gold, but because of the size of the American economy, the strength of its financial institutions, and the trust built over decades of global trade. Oil markets, international banking, and financial investments continued to rely heavily on dollar transactions. As global trade expanded, the dollar became deeply embedded in the world economy. A system that had once depended on gold was replaced by one built on confidence, markets, and geopolitical influence. The transformation marked the beginning of the modern financial age, a world where money was no longer defined by metal stored in vaults, but by the power of global economic networks. More than 50 years after the end of the gold-backed dollar, the global financial system still operates on the foundation built during those historic decisions. Today, money is no longer defined by gold stored in vaults, but by the strength of economies, the stability of institutions, and the confidence of markets around the world. The United States dollar continues to dominate global trade, international banking, and energy markets. Governments hold it as a reserve, corporations use it for international transactions, and investors rely on it as a financial benchmark. Yet the system remains complex and constantly evolving. New financial powers have emerged, technology has transformed global markets, and digital currencies are beginning to challenge traditional ideas about money. The story that began in the mountains of Bretton Woods and changed forever in 1971 is still unfolding today. Every trade, every international investment, and every currency exchange continues to shape the balance of economic power across the world. The modern financial system may look stable on the surface, but like every system before it, its future will ultimately depend on trust, cooperation, and the decisions made by leaders in the years ahead.